"You're too young for an old rancher like me," I said, and she looked up with those steady gray eyes and whispered, "To me, you're perfect." I nearly dropped the reins right there in the mud. Nobody had called me perfect in 31 years of walking this earth, and I sure didn't expect to hear it from a girl half my age standing on my porch with a carpetbag and a letter she'd carried 2,000 miles. My name's Thomas Weller, and I'd been alone on that ranch outside Cheyenne since my wife, Sarah, died birthing our boy, and the boy didn't make it either. That was 6 years gone by the time this story starts. 6 years of cooking for one, of talking to the horses more than any living soul, of watching my hands turn rough and my face turn leathery under that Wyoming sun. I wasn't an old man, not truly, 37 when it happened, but grief has a way of aging a man from the inside, where nobody can see it but him. I hadn't meant to send for a bride. It was my neighbor, Hollis Granger, who put the notion in my head one night over cards and whiskey. Said a man alone was a man half finished and that plenty of good women back east would trade city poverty for a chance at land and honest work. I laughed him off. But loneliness has long fingers, and it reached into me at night when the wind came down off the mountains and rattled the shutters, and by spring I'd written the letter myself, though I tore up 4 drafts before I sent the 5th. I didn't lie in that letter. I told her straight. I was 37, widowed, no children living, 300 acres of cattle land, a house that needed a woman's touch, and a face that had seen hard winters. I told her I wasn't looking for romance, just partnership, just somebody to share the work and the silence. Her name was Eliza Fontaine, and she wrote back in a hand so fine and careful, I figured she must have been raised proper, maybe too proper for ranch life. She was 20 years old. 20. I read that number 3 times before I let myself believe it, and then I nearly wrote back and called the whole thing off. But her letter said things that stuck in me like a burr in wool. She wrote that her father had died owing money to men who didn't forgive debts, that her mother had passed the winter before from the fever, and that she had one younger brother, 12 years old, who needed feeding and a roof that didn't leak. She wrote that she wasn't afraid of hard work, and that she'd rather marry a stranger with land than starve pretty in a city that had already forgotten her family's name. There was no self-pity in it, just facts laid out plain, the way you tell a man the price of grain. So I sent the money for her passage, and hers, and her brother's too, though I hadn't planned on taking in a boy. Something about the way she wrote about him, Samuel she called him, like he was the only soft thing left in her life, made me unable to refuse. She arrived on a gray October afternoon, dust blowing sideways across the platform, and when she stepped down from that train, I felt something crack open in my chest that I'd kept sealed shut since Sarah's funeral. She wasn't beautiful in the way saloon girls are beautiful, all paint and lace. She was beautiful the way a hard winter morning is beautiful. Clear-eyed, plain-dressed, standing straight despite the wind trying to knock her over. Samuel stood beside her, thin as a fence post, holding her hand so tight his knuckles had gone white. "Mr. Weller?" she said, and her voice was steadier than mine when I answered. "That's me," I said. "You must be tired from the journey." "Tired doesn't matter much," she said. "Is there work to be done?" I laughed before I could stop myself, and it was the first real laugh I'd let out in longer than I cared to admit. That first month, I kept my distance the way a man keeps distance from a fire he's afraid will burn him. I gave her the second bedroom, showed Samuel where he'd sleep in the loft above the kitchen, and I stayed out working the cattle from before dawn until well past supper most days, telling myself it was the season's demands and not my own cowardice. We were married by the circuit preacher 2 weeks after she arrived. A small dry ceremony in my front room with Hollis and his wife as witnesses. And that night I slept in the barn on a cotangent of I kept there for calving season, and I told her it was because a mare was due to foal. She didn't argue, but I caught her watching me sometimes across the supper table, those gray eyes studying me like she was trying to read a book written in a language she almost understood. It was Samuel who broke things open first, the way children do without meaning to. He'd taken to following me around the ranch, asking questions about everything, why the cattle needed branding, why the fence posts were set the way they were, why I never sang like the other ranch hands did when they worked. One evening, mending fence in the last light, he asked me straight out why I married his sister if I wasn't going to act married. "That's not a question for a boy your age," I told him. "She cried last night," he said. "Thought I was asleep." She wasn't loud about it, but I heard. I didn't say anything to that, just kept twisting wire around the post until my hands ached, and that ache gave me something to feel besides the shame climbing up my throat. I found her the next morning in the kitchen, flour on her hands, sunlight coming through the window and catching the loose strands of her hair that had come free from her braid. I stood in the doorway a long moment before she noticed me. "Eliza," I said, "I owe you an explanation." She wiped her hands on her apron and waited, not saying a word, which somehow made it harder than if she'd pushed. "You're 20 years old," I said. "I'm 37. I've buried a wife and a son, and some days I still wake up reaching for people who aren't there. You came here for safety, for your brother, and that's a fair enough reason, but I won't have you trapped in a marriage to a man who's more ghost than husband. You deserve someone whole, someone closer to your own years who can give you a life that isn't just surviving." That's when she said it. Set down the bowl she was holding, walked around that table, and looked up at me with an expression I hadn't earned and didn't understand. "You think I don't know grief, Thomas Weller? I watched my father drink himself into an early grave because he couldn't pay men who threatened to hurt Samuel if he didn't. I held my mother's hand while the fever took her, and I promised her I'd keep Samuel safe, and I meant it with everything in me. I'm not 20 because I've lived an easy 20 years. I'm 20 and I've buried more than most folks bury by 50. I opened my mouth to answer, but she wasn't finished. "You keep saying I deserve someone whole, but I've never once needed whole. I needed someone honest and steady and kind to my brother, and you've been all three since the day I stepped off that train, even sleeping in that barn like a fool. You think your age is a wound. Maybe it is, but it's not the wound you think it is. You're not too old for me, Thomas. You're just afraid I'll leave the way everyone else has left you." I stood there, with my hat in my hands like a schoolboy caught lying because she'd named the thing I hadn't even named to myself. "You're too young for an old rancher," I said again, quieter this time because it was the only argument I had left, worn thin as it was. And she stepped close enough that I could smell the flour and the wood smoke on her, and she whispered, "To me, you're perfect." I won't pretend that fixed everything between us in a single breath. Trust doesn't work that way. Not for a man who's buried a family, and not for a woman who's buried the same kind of losses in her own fashion. But something shifted that morning. Some latch that had been rusted shut finally gave. I moved back into the house that night, not into her bed, not yet, but into the front room, closer, present, no longer hiding behind cattle and fences and the excuse of a mare that wasn't due for another month anyway. The trouble came in November, the way trouble tends to come when a man's finally found a reason to hope. The debt collectors that had chased Eliza's father chased his memory clear across 2 states, and one of them, a hard-faced man named Vance Deary, showed up at my ranch claiming Eliza's father's debt had transferred by marriage, that I owed him $300 or he'd take it in property, or worse, in the boy. "The boy's under my protection now," I told him, standing between Deary and the porch steps where Samuel had gone still as stone. "You want money? You take it up with a lawyer. You come near that boy again, you'll answer to me." Deary laughed, ugly and slow. "Big talk for a man who married himself a pauper bride. Word is you paid good money to bring in a wife who couldn't afford her own train fare. Whole county's laughing about it, Weller. Old man buying himself a young wife because no woman his own age would have him. I felt the old shame flood up, the same shame that had kept me sleeping in that barn, but this time it didn't stay shame. It turned into something else. Something with teeth. "Get off my land," I said, "before I forget I'm a man who minds his manners." He left, but he left threatening to take it to the county, to spread word that made Eliza sound bought and desperate rather than brave. And I knew the kind of poison that could do to a young woman's reputation in a town that already whispered about mail-order marriages. That night, Eliza found me on the porch, staring out at nothing, and she sat beside me without asking permission, which I'd come to understand was just her way. "I heard what he said," she told me, "about being bought. Don't listen to him. I'm not ashamed, Thomas." Her voice was fierce in the dark. "I came here on my own choosing. Nobody bought me. I chose you same as you chose me, and if this whole county wants to whisper about it, let them whisper. I've survived worse than whispers. He could ruin your name here before you've had a chance to build one. Then we build it together, or it doesn't get built at all." She reached over and took my hand, rough as it was, calloused from 37 years of work, and she held it like it was something worth holding. "You keep trying to protect me from things I've already survived. Let me stand next to you instead of behind you." I sold 2 of my best steers that week to pay off what remained of the debt, not because the law required it, but because I wanted Deary gone from our lives entirely, wanted no shadow of her father's failures hanging over Samuel's head as he grew. It cost me near everything I'd saved that year. Hollis called me a fool for paying a debt that likely wasn't even legally binding on me. Maybe I am a fool, I told him, but I'd rather be a poor fool than a rich man who let that girl carry her father's shame on top of everything else she's already carrying. Word got around town anyway, the way word does, twisted and cruel at first. Old rancher desperate enough to buy a bride, young girl trapped by circumstance into an unequal marriage. I watched Eliza hold her chin up through church on Sunday while women twice her age looked at her sideways. I watched Samuel come home from the schoolhouse with a bruised knuckle and a torn shirt because some older boy had said something about his sister that he wouldn't repeat to me, only that he'd made the boy take it back. It was Eliza who ended the whispering, not me. She stood up at the town social in December, in front of half the county, when old Mrs. Pruitt made some pointed comment about young women who marry for land instead of love, and Eliza didn't flinch. I married Thomas Weller because he wrote me an honest letter when he could have written a flattering one, she said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. He told me his age, his losses, his hardships, same as he told me his land and his cattle. He didn't dress himself up to win me, and when a man I owed nothing to found out my family's debts had followed us here, my husband sold 2 prize steers rather than let a stranger threaten my brother. I'll take that kind of man over 100 smooth-talking suitors my own age who never once had to prove what they were made of. If that shames anyone in this room, it isn't me. The hall went quiet enough to hear the fire crackling in the stove. I stood at the back, hat in hand, and I don't mind saying my eyes went wet because in 37 years, nobody had ever stood up for me like that. Not even Sarah, God rest her, who I'd loved dearly but who'd never needed defending on my behalf. Things were different after that, both in town and in our house. The whispers didn't vanish entirely, they rarely do in a place that small, but they softened into something more like grudging respect. And between Eliza and me, that latch that had cracked open in October swung wide by winter's deep cold. I moved back into our bedroom on a night when the first real blizzard came howling down from the mountains, ice on every window pane, and she was sitting up reading by lamplight when I came in from checking the cattle, half frozen, and she didn't say a word, just pulled back the quilt and made room, and that was that. Samuel took to calling me something other than Mr. Weller sometime that spring, just Tom, easy as anything, the way a boy calls a man he trusts. I taught him to ride properly, to read brands, to mend fence without cutting his fingers open on the wire. He grew 2 inches that first year and put on weight he badly needed, and something in me that had gone hollow since my own boy died began, slowly, to fill back in. Eliza and I never spoke again about the years between us, not as a problem needing solving. It simply stopped mattering, the way most fears stop mattering once you've stood in the fire they warned you about and found you could bear the heat. She wasn't a girl playing at being a wife. She ran that house and that ranch's books with a sharpness that put my own bookkeeping to shame, argued cattle prices with buyers twice her age and won more often than she lost, and raised her brother with a fierceness that made the whole county understand, eventually, that underestimating Eliza Weller was a mistake made only once. There was a night, near a year after she'd first stepped off that train, when we sat together on the porch, Samuel already asleep in the loft, the cattle quiet in the near pasture, stars thick enough overhead to light the yard without a lantern. I told her then what I hadn't told her before, that I'd nearly torn up that final letter I sent her, that some part of me had been certain no young woman would choose a worn-out rancher over the men her own age back east, certain I was asking her to settle for less than she deserved. "You never asked me to settle," she said, leaning her head against my shoulder, the wind carrying the smell of wood smoke from the chimney. "You asked me to choose, and I did. I choose you every morning I wake up in this house, Thomas. Not because I have to, because I want to." I thought about all those years I'd spent believing my age, my losses, my hard hands and harder silences made me somehow less deserving of a full life, less worthy of being chosen freely rather than settled for out of necessity. I thought about the wife I'd buried and the years I'd spent talking mostly to horses, convinced that chapter of my life had closed for good the day Sarah died. "I said you were too young for an old rancher," I told her, my voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "And I told you," she said, tilting her face up to mine, gray eyes catching what little starlight reached the porch, "that to me, you're perfect. I still mean it. I'll mean it when you're 70 and I'm still chasing after you to slow down on that horse." Out past the fence line, an owl called once into the dark, and the cattle shifted and settled, And I understood, sitting there with her weight against my shoulder and the whole quiet ranch breathing around us, that I hadn't rescued Eliza Fontaine from poverty at all. She'd walked into my house carrying nothing but a carpetbag and a terrified younger brother. And somewhere in that first hard year, without either of us quite marking the day it happened, she'd rescued me right back.